Under the Speaker's announced policy of January 3rd, 2017, the gentleman from Colorado, Mr. Perlmutter, is recognized for 60 minutes as the designee of the Minority Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Tonight, as we have every other week for the last few months, we want to talk about the Mueller investigation and the kinds of results that are being developed by the FBI, by the Department of Justice, on a lot of very serious topics. That main topic is the Russians interfering with our elections, particularly the 2016 election. That kind of interference goes to the heart of our nation, goes to the heart of our freedom, goes to the heart of our independence, goes to the heart of this country's sovereignty, to be able to make decisions without interference by nations other than the United States of America, other than us as citizens of the United States of America. Now, I think we need to step back and think about this a little bit, because it's clear now, just today, the Senate Republican chair of the Intelligence Committee said there's no doubt that Russia undertook an unprecedented effort to interfere with our 2016 elections. And he says he looks forward to completing the committee's inquiry and issuing findings and recommendations to Americans. The vice chairman, Senator Warner from Virginia, says, after thorough review, our staff concluded that the intelligence community's conclusions were accurate and on point. The Russian effort was extensive, sophisticated, and ordered by President Putin himself for the purpose of helping Donald Trump and hurting Hillary Clinton. In order to protect our democracy from future threats, we must understand what happened in 2016. So a year ago, Special Counsel Robert Mueller was appointed to look into this affair and what exactly happened, and to bring those to justice who broke our laws, who interfered with our sovereignty and our freedoms. But all along the way, the White House has objected, has tried to describe it as a witch hunt, as a hoax, as nothing but a charade, when in fact, in this one-year period, there have been 5 guilty pleas and 22 indictments. And we kind of got to go back to the beginning, Mr. Speaker. A year ago, Democrats were asking the president to turn over his tax returns, which all presidents have done, which candidates do. The president refused and continues to refuse to this day to turn over his tax returns. So the question is, what's in there to hide? What's the big deal? What's he afraid of us seeing in those tax returns? Today, came out in the news that the financial disclosure statement shows a payment to Michael Cohen, his attorney, that he said he never made. We've got to get to the bottom of these numbers, to the bottom of this Russian interference. Mr. Mueller and the FBI need to be able to finish their investigation without interference, without any obstruction. For all of us as Americans, this applies to the very core of what a democracy is, and that's free, fair, and unimpeded elections. So there are 3 key questions that we keep asking. And we ask our friends on the Republican side, particularly Speaker Ryan, the Senate Majority Leader McConnell, let's move forward with investigations here in this Congress. Why not? Let's find out what's really going on. Let's protect this investigation so that threats by the White House to fire Mr. Mueller, to fire Rod Rosenstein from the Department of Justice. They did fire individuals out of the FBI. Let's let these detectives and these law enforcement officials finish their job. But the questions are, what are they hiding? What are they afraid that people will see? And why not let the detectives and the law enforcement officers finish their job? Let's play this out and see exactly what the facts are so we all know what happened and how we can stop it from happening again to make sure we have free and fair elections. Now, I've been able to ask these questions and participate in this hour or these special orders with several of my friends. And one of those who has taken a keen interest in protecting this investigation and making sure that the facts do come to light has been my friend Jared Huffman from Northern California. And so I'd like to yield to him for some of his thoughts as to where we are, because we've had many, many changes in terms of the lawyers who were representing either the White House or the president. Personally, they're gone. We got new lawyers, former district attorney and mayor Giuliani is now involved. Other people, the president's personal lawyer, Mr. Cohen, is now out and under investigation himself. So there seems to be something happening pretty much every day, and I'd just like to get my friends' thoughts about it.
Well, I thank the gentleman from Colorado, and you're right. The pace of revelations and controversies surrounding this Trump White House and their personal, financial, and political involvement with Russia, their attempts to interfere with and obstruct justice relating to Mr. Mueller's investigation, the pace of all that is just dizzying. And so here we are 1 year into the work of Special Counsel Mueller. And I'm glad that you began your remarks, Congressman Perlmutter, by reminding us of the context of this issue. The fact that what happened in the 2016 presidential election was a big deal. It was unprecedented. A foreign adversary maliciously interfered in our election with a specific intent to help one candidate and to hurt another. They placed a bet on Donald Trump. They put their thumb on the scale in every way they could to help Donald Trump. And maybe that's why all along he's been reluctant to acknowledge what obviously happened. He doesn't want to talk about it. He wants to write it all off as a witch hunt and a conspiracy theory because he probably feels a little defensive about that cloud of legitimacy involving Russian interference. But based on what we know so far, there may be an even more sinister explanation for some of his behavior. It may be that he, or at least a lot of people very close to him, were actively working with the Russians as part of this. That's what the Mueller investigation is looking into, and that's what the American people have to find out. We have to know the full extent of exactly what happened, no matter where those facts may lead. And the truth is, at this 1 year mark in this historic investigation, this historic scandal, there's plenty of reason to worry about what President Trump might do by way of trying to block and stop and interfere with this investigation. It's not just us saying it. You can look at his own words. He has said at various times in recent months, quote, at some point I will have no choice but to use the powers granted to the presidency and get involved. That's obviously a threat, whether that is using his pardon power or beginning to fire people in the Department of Justice, the FBI, or even the special counsel himself. He has threatened to reveal conflicts of interest of the special counsel. Obviously, this is a favorite tactic of President Trump, trying to intimidate, trying to posture with folks who he perceives as adversaries. He said on another occasion, Mueller is most conflicted of all except Rosenstein, who signed FISA and Comey letter, no collusion, so they go crazy. These are the ravings of someone who's acting very defensively. And I would say, as a former attorney, you're a former attorney yourself, Congressman Perlmutter, it really speaks to a consciousness of guilt. We would argue that if we were in a court of law and we had evidence of statements such as this. Repeatedly calling this investigation a witch hunt. On another occasion, he says, I've been saying all along, it's all a big hoax by the Democrats based on payments and lies. There should never have been a special counsel appointed. Witch hunt. On another occasion, he said, why don't I just fire Mueller? Well, we'll see what happens. Taken together, all of his various statements should be very troubling to anyone who cares about the independence of our law enforcement agencies, about the integrity of this critically important investigation. So I am glad to stand with you tonight and every night that we've had these special order hours to continue to make sure that our colleagues here in the House know that we're going to defend this investigation, that we are going to do everything we can to make sure that our law enforcement professionals and special counsel Mueller have the chance to fully follow the evidence wherever it may lead, to get the truth out to the American people. We deserve nothing less. And with that, I'm happy to yield back and glad to see our colleague Joe Courtney from Connecticut joining the conversation.
Well, and I thank my friend from Northern California, and his points are really well taken. This investigation, rather than just sort of, pushing some paper around, we've had other special counsel appointed from time to time, and just in this one year, some of them take years. Whether it was Contra affair or Watergate or whatever, it takes years and years. Here, really in 1 year, we've had, 13 Russians, Russian either agencies or corporations and individuals indicted. We've had at least 6, 7 Americans indicted in this whole process. Recently, as I think within the last few days, or maybe it was even today, Paul Manafort, the chairman of the campaign, the Trump campaign, objected to the indictment that he found himself under, went to court, said that Mueller had exceeded his authority by bringing the indictment, and the judge said, no, that indictment stands. And so this thing, they're really, there's been a lot of smoke. We know that there's some fire creating that smoke, and we've got to find that, and we've got to find precisely what happened. So my friend from Connecticut has joined us, and he's got some thoughts about this. So, Mr. Courtney, will you share?
Sure. Well, first of all, I want to thank Congressman Perlmutter and Congressman Huffman, who've been, again, diligent in terms of coming to the floor on a regular basis to push back against what's clearly a pretty coordinated, concerted effort to discredit the Mueller investigation. Really pretty disturbing on many levels. Fundamentally because it's really an attack on institutions of our country, which really we all took an oath to uphold and defend. Rule of law is frankly one of the fundamental pillars of this country in terms of being a free society. And when you have folks who, again, are holding public office, going beyond just disagreements of opinion regarding actions that all of us as public officials have to be held accountable for, but to really attack the institutions themselves, which is really clearly the drumbeat of criticism of the Mueller investigation and where it's headed, is something that really we need to speak out and push back against. And again, the 1-year anniversary is a very, I think, important moment to sort of step back and reflect in terms of where this investigation started and where it is today. Again, if you go back a year ago and look at the reaction that greeted this appointment from, again, Republican leaders, Newt Gingrich, Robert Mueller is a superb choice to be special counsel. His reputation is impeccable for honesty and integrity. Speaker Paul Ryan, my priority has been to ensure thorough and independent investigations are allowed to follow the facts where they may lead. The addition of Robert Mueller as special counsel is consistent with this goal, and I welcome his role at the Department of Justice. Senator Cory Gardner, Robert Mueller has incredible reputation. Senator Orrin Hatch, I commend the Department of Justice for bringing an independent voice to help clarify this situation. The list goes on and on. And again, why not? I mean, Robert Mueller is somebody whose record of service to this country, going back to when he was a Marine in Vietnam, led a rifle platoon, was wounded, received a Purple Heart, as well as the Vietnamese Cross of Gallantry and 2 Navy Commendation Medals for his military service. He went on, obviously, to become a distinguished legal practitioner, was appointed by President Bush to be the head of the FBI, and did such a great job after his 10-year term. The U.S. Senate extended his term by 2 years by a vote of 100-0. Wow. So, I mean, when you're talking about somebody who has really earned a reputation for being really a pretty conservative prosecutor, both in terms of his time as a U.S. attorney and also in terms of his term as head of the FBI, we're dealing with someone who is beyond reproach, frankly. And as you pointed out, Mr. Perlmutter, the decision that came down at the Washington, D.C. District Court by federal judge Amy Berman Jackson, a 37-page opinion, which, again, pushed back very powerfully about the notion that somehow he has strayed from his mission that the Department of Justice gave him. Again, her decision, just in case after case, points out that the indictment of Manafort fell perfectly within the charge that he was given by Assistant U.S. Attorney Rosenstein, which, again, is to investigate other issues that, quote, may arise from the investigation. Again, in the case of Manafort, I mean, we're talking about somebody who was squarely within the intelligence community's conclusion that the election was basically under attack from Russians. Manafort's connections to Ukrainian interests, which clearly were sort of on the Russian side of the Ukrainian politics, is just an obvious place for the special counsel to pursue. So, again, as you point out, the number of indictments, the number of convictions clearly show that this is not a fishing expedition. It's not a witch hunt. It's a serious prosecution whose every step of the way actions have been ratified by the courts and also ratified by the appointing authority, Mr. Rosenstein. And it is time for all elected officials to step back and let this process proceed. Again, people can the forensics on this in terms of just the endorsements to Mr. Mueller's credibility and experience and knowledge in this area scream out for all of us to respect the rule of law and let this investigation proceed. So again, thank you for holding this event on the 1-year milestone of the Mueller investigation.
Well, and I thank my friend from Connecticut, and he's reminded me of something, and I think something that has really infuriated me is the president's attacks on the FBI, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, our chief and top law enforcement agency in this country. Is it perfect? Absolutely not. But are they doing their job to the best of their ability to protect Americans, to protect America? Absolutely. And for the president to sort of just continue to chip away and to excoriate the FBI because it's undertaking an investigation that may implicate him in breaking laws of the United States of America, I think is something that we haven't seen. And this investigation needs to continue to do its work, to talk to witnesses, to determine what has occurred here. And, you know, the Senate Judiciary today, or within the last day or two, released thousands of pages of testimony and information. And one of the places that it talked about was to try to what happened at a meeting I think it was at the Trump Tower,
Yep.
in June of 2016, so 5 months, 6 months before the election, between a Russian attorney, I think another Russian was there, Paul Manafort, the chairman of the campaign, Jared Kushner, son-in-law of the president, and Donald Trump Jr., his son. And there is a lot of concern about what actually occurred in that particular meeting. I mean, there is a lot of material here that is very, very troubling. Yeah. And so, again, I'd ask my friend from California, I know he's thought about this. He's thought about, Mr. Giuliani saying that Donald Trump might take the Fifth Amendment, which I think came out of nowhere. I mean, but why would he want to take the Fifth Amendment? Again, the question is, what is he hiding? What's he afraid of? Let's just let law enforcement complete its work. Yeah. So I turn it back to my friend from California.
Well, I thank the gentleman. A couple of thoughts. First of all, that infamous Trump Tower meeting in June of 2016 just stinks to high heaven. You're absolutely right. Anyone who looks objectively at what we know about that meeting, anyone who's not hosting a show on Fox News at least, would feel that there's a big, big problem here, and we got to ask some hard questions. Of course, Donald Trump Jr. initially outright lied about it, said it was about adoption, and only when we saw the full text of the email exchange, making it very clear that this was the front-end part of a quid pro quo between the Trump operation and the Russians. This was the offer of assistance, of dirt, of a bombshell on the Clinton campaign. And of course, that was greeted with enthusiasm by Trump Jr., who hastily arranged the meeting, brought in the top brass, said he was very excited about it if it's what he thought it was. And then when it proved not to reveal that bombshell, he immediately expressed how disappointed he was. And some phone calls ensued. And one of those phone calls is from a restricted number, and he claims he didn't remember exactly who that call was. Well, it turns out his dad, our president now, has a restricted number, and that's a knowable fact. If our colleagues on the House Intelligence Committee were serious about this investigation, they would find out who that phone call was to, because it's one of the dots that could need to be connected around this very controversial Trump Tower meeting. But they're not interested at all. They didn't ask those questions. They didn't even require Trump Jr. to answer the questions, and they have rushed to shut down their investigation. So that brings me to the other point. You talked about, we've all talked about the threats to the Mueller investigation from President Trump himself, but there's another threat from within these walls, from our colleagues on the House Intelligence Committee, who have taken this sacred trust of oversight that we have as members of Congress and unfortunately compromised it to the level that they seem to simply be fronting for the president instead of doing a genuine investigation. Unlike their colleagues in the Senate, who at least acknowledged the obvious, that Russia was trying to help President Trump in its interference, their report doesn't even say that. And then they include a gratuitous statement that they find no evidence of collusion, despite everything we've been talking about, everything that's already in the public record. We've got a real problem within these walls that also threatens the investigation.
If the gentleman would yield to me for a second, you talked about quid pro quo, and the thing that I'm worried about, I serve on the terrorism and illicit finance subcommittee of financial services, where we deal a lot with sanctions. Sanctions against North Korea, sanctions against Iran, sanctions against China, sanctions against Russia. And with Russia having gone into Ukraine, Russia having gone into Crimea, and then Russia having interfered with our elections, a lot of sanctions are out there. But this administration seems to be using kid gloves in applying them.
Well, and if the gentleman would, you've just hit on the quo. So we talked about the quid, these solicitations from Russia through Papadopoulos, even earlier in April, the spring of 2016. Those solicitations were welcomed and embraced by the highest levels of the Trump campaign, possibly including Mr. Trump himself. We nail down that phone call and a few other details. But now you're talking about the quo part. What would Russia get in return? And we know from undisputed evidence that Mike Flynn was working on sanctions relief even before they took office, during the transition, violating apparently the Logan Act as he was doing it. We know that this president and others in his administration have bent over backwards to try to cut Russia brakes on these sanctions. So you're exactly right to focus on that obvious piece, the quo part of this seeming quid pro quo. Another reason why we have to let this investigation run its course so that we can find out exactly what happened here.
So, and I appreciate that. I know my friend from Connecticut has some other thoughts, so I'd like to yield to him.
Sure. Well, real briefly, again, as I mentioned earlier, and the two of you have alluded, again, we're talking about, an effort to discredit the Mueller investigation that, again, I think really, as all Americans, we really should be concerned about the, questions about whether or not our court system, is truly fair, whether or not the FBI, the leading law enforcement agency of this country, is corrupt, which is, again, some of the language that's been sort of tossed around by the president's defenders. The harm that does in terms of, really basic institutions in this country is something that I just think you can't sort of treat it as normal political discourse. We're talking about, real long-lasting harm to the country. The FBI right now, there's counterterrorism agents that are hard at work, literally as we're standing here on this floor, keeping this country safe. They are involved in investigations of mass shootings. You see the FBI jackets, when these events happen, and they were in Connecticut, when Sandy Hook took place. And I would just say, from a personal standpoint, my parents both served in the FBI. My dad was a G man back in the day, and my mother actually was a clerical worker there. That's how they met, actually. And so I guess you could say I was born under the watchful eye of the FBI. But the fact of the matter is that he was somebody who really was very proud of his service. Again, it was during World War II. His job was actually tracking fifth columnists in the U.S. who were looking to cause sabotage to critical facilities in the country. So, again, there's always in every organization instances where there's bad apples, but the fact of the matter is, as an institution in terms of law enforcement, these agents are out there every single day, protecting this country, and to attack not just an individual decision, but an institution is, again, the real sort of level that we're watching happen here with the pushback on the Mueller investigation. And it's just, it's really totally unacceptable. And as I said, on the one-year anniversary, it has proved its credibility, the Mueller team, in terms of concrete, real results. And the courts, and as I said, the Department of Justice have repeatedly reconfirmed and reaffirmed the rationale for the creation of the Mueller investigation and the fact that it is operating totally within the mission and charge that was given. So again, I think it's important for all of us to continue to raise our voices and defend rule of law and institutions that are out there to protect our Constitution and our democracy. Yield back to you.
Well,
Mr.
and I thank my friend, and we'll wrap up this portion of our special orders, because I know we have another subject that Ms. Pingree and Mr. Blumenauer, Mr. Tonko would like to address. But I think, and I thank my friends for joining me today. I mean, the seriousness of this subject can't be overstated. The impact on elections, the trust in our system of elections, the trust in our law enforcement, the trust in our courts, the trust, which is attacked by this president and too many others of our institutions of the press, whether it's the Washington Post or the New York Times or somebody investigating, goes to trust of this nation and what we have formed. And when you've got outside influences like Russia sticking their nose in our business, and trying to put their thumb on the scale as to who should run this nation. I can't think of a higher crime. And we know the National Security Advisor for Donald Trump, Michael Flynn, indicted. Rick Gates, campaign advisor for the Trump campaign. George Papadopoulos, foreign affairs advisor for Trump campaign. Richard Panetto, Alex Vander Swan, all indicted, sentenced, or at least pled guilty. Indicted still, the campaign chairman, Paul Manafort, 13 Russian nationals, and 3 Russian entities. This investigation needs to get to the bottom of all of this. We got to try to figure out, is there anything being hidden? Is there anything that we as Americans should know about this interference that we don't know today? And our law enforcement officers, from Robert Mueller to the FBI to the cop on the beat, need to be allowed to finish this investigation. So with that, I want to thank my friend from California, my friend from Connecticut. I'd like to yield to my friend from Maine, because she seems to be ready to go here, and I don't know about her 2 colleagues, the one from New York and the one from Oregon, because they seem to be kind of getting ready, but not nearly as ready as my friend Congresswoman Pingree from Maine. So, Mr. Speaker, I'm going to yield to my friend from Maine. No, it's still part of, but I have to stay. So.
Well, I really appreciate, thank you very much, Mr. Perlmutter, for yielding, and thank you for really the eloquent conversation you've been having for the last half an hour about the extreme importance of the investigation that's going on, and recognizing the fact that this is the 1-year anniversary, and obviously we still have a long ways to go, and this is a very critical issue, and we need to continue to support Robert Mueller and the work that he's doing.